take a look at chapter 42 of Genesis, and I'm not going to read the entire passage because it's kind of a long one with 38 verses, but I want to do a real quick recap for that and kind of give you an idea of where we are and then pick up with the study. In Genesis, we've been studying about Jacob. Jacob obviously had it pretty rough. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers. The people who bought him then sold him to a guy by the name of Potiphar, who was the captain of the Pharaoh's bodyguard. And he was more than likely a very, very tough individual. I mean, they were a brutal group of authorities. Potiphar's wife accuses Jacob of attempting to rape her, and it was a total setup. So Jacob gets thrown into jail. He gets forgotten while he's in jail. A couple of the king's, or the Pharaoh's people, were thrown into jail also. We're not told why, but he has compassion on them, and he cares for them, and he ministers to them, helps them to understand and see some things of the Lord. And then they forget about it. They get out of jail, or one of them actually is put to death, and the other one goes back to serving Pharaoh, but he forgets about Jacob, and Jacob is another couple of years in the prison. And then he finally is brought to Pharaoh's court to help Pharaoh understand a dream that he had, actually a couple of dreams, and now his life is turned around. And so now he's given favor and he's being used. And all of these things that happen in Jacob's life somehow or other come into play in his role and his responsibility. Well, one of the things that Jacob saw when he was interpreting Pharaoh's dream was that there was going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of drought. And it was going to be a very, very difficult time. And so he warned the Pharaoh about this, and Pharaoh was so impressed, and he said, where can we find somebody? And one of the things that he said, you need to have somebody who can take responsibility and gather up enough food so that there will be food for that 7-year period of drought. Pharaoh was impressed with this, talks to his people, and they say, who can we find that can take responsibility for that? And who has the Spirit of God, which is something that Pharaoh pointed out, which I thought was interesting. And they decide, look, he's the one who saw it, and he obviously has handled himself well. Look how he's managed the prison, because he had been in charge of the prison. Look how he managed Potiphar's home and all of those things. So they put him in charge, and he becomes essentially the prime minister of Egypt. And now he's in charge, and the 7 years of plenty have passed. They collected all the food, put it in the storehouse, and sure enough, now the 7 years of drought starts. And it's so desperate, it's such a tough time that it is affecting beyond just Egypt. And so, sure enough, over in the land of Canaan and other places, obviously, this drought has affected them. And they find that they learn that there's food or grain in particular, in Egypt. So now the sons, Jacob's sons, decide that they're going to go to Egypt to try to buy some grain. And so they go to Egypt, not knowing, of course, that that's where Jacob is. And sure enough, Jacob is the prime minister who's in charge of dispensing all of the food and selling the grain, particularly to foreigners, apparently. And Jacob realizes who his brothers are. They don't recognize him. They don't know who he is. I mean, he was just a boy when they got rid of him. So Jacob, Joseph, one of them. And you guys figure it out. If you haven't figured it out yet, then there's no point in going on. So John had I'm way too old for this, brother. So, all right, who is it that was in jail? Joseph. So Joseph is now the prime minister of Egypt. Got that straight? Somebody want to come up and take over, because all right, so now the brothers see their brother, whatever his name was, and they don't recognize him, probably don't even remember his name for that matter. So, and they move on. Now we're going to see this story, and some would consider this story to be kind of turnabout's fair play, if you will. Joseph has Joseph or Jacob? Joseph has the opportunity to get back at his brothers for what they've done to him. And in fact, he does get the opportunity to get back at them, but not in a retaliatory way. One of the things that we've discovered about Joseph is that he apparently doesn't hold grudges. In his position now of great authority, he's second in command, really, he's just below Pharaoh. In his position of great authority, he could retaliate. He could get back at Potiphar and Potiphar's wife for accusing him of rape and throwing him in jail. He could retaliate against the butler who had forgotten about him and left him in prison. And now he has a chance to get back at his brothers, and instead he understands that he has a greater calling, and that is to be usable by God. So it's not about retaliation or getting even or getting back. Now his focus is, how can I be used by God? What is it that I can do that can be used by God? So what happens is his brothers come to him to ask for food. And the irony of the situation is not lost on Joseph. Look what happens in Genesis chapter 42. We're picking up with verses 6, and you have the passage there in your Bible study guide. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all his people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Now, does this sound somewhat vaguely familiar to you? It should. Let's go back and look at the very thing that set the brothers off and caused them to reject Joseph and sell him into slavery. It's back in Genesis 37. He was a young man at the time, and he says to his brothers, "Hey, listen to this. Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." And his brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So back in his early days, he has this dream that his brothers are going to bow down to him. And he tells his brothers this, and of course they get angry, and that's when they took him, and they were going to kill him, and instead they decided to sell him as a slave. So Joseph remembers that. In fact, back in Genesis chapter 42, verses 8 and 9, it says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them. And so he says to them, "You guys are spies. You've come to see where our land is unprotected." Now, Joseph is doing something very, very interesting here, very smart. And it sounds like he's just having fun with them, but he's not. He's putting them into a position where they have to do, and they are basically at his mercy. And so they need to respond to him correctly. Joseph acts every bit the Egyptian authority, and he challenges them. And he makes a common charge that they're not there for good. It would be something that any major authority would say to a foreigner that comes into their land. "What are you doing here? Are you here to spy out the land and perhaps to do some harm?" And it was a charge that was probably ludicrous to both parties. I mean, I suspect that Joseph knew good and well that they weren't there to do any harm, and they certainly knew they weren't there to do any harm. They just wanted to buy some grain. They wanted to get some food. But they respond to him, and it's so interesting how they answer him. Now, remember that they remember the history now. And this is what they say to Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph, right? This is what they say to him. And they say, "Look, we're 12 brothers, and and we have one father, and we're 12 brothers, although one brother is no more." Who's the brother that is no more? Joseph. And then at the same time they say, "We're honest men, not spies." So now Joseph's listening to them explain this. "Listen, we're 12 brothers, one of them is no more, but we're honest men." And I wonder if Joseph thought, "Really? Tell me about your brother." I wish you would have said that. Wouldn't that have been cool if that was in the Bible, if Joseph just said, "So tell me about your brother that is no more. What was he like? Was he good looking? Was he talented? Did his father like him best?" See, that's why God didn't give me 12 brothers. Because I would have just had too much fun. Joseph must have wondered about, they must have raised an eyebrow when they said, hey, we're honest men. We're not spies. And so they explain who they are, and they tell them about their father and their youngest brother. The youngest brother's name is Benjamin. Now remember, there were only 2 sons born to Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The other brothers were half-brothers to Joseph, born by Leah and the handmaidens. And so Joseph hears that Benjamin is doing well, and he's the youngest brother, and he's back at home. And there's a twinge there. He recognizes that his brother, his real brother, his full brother, is okay, and he's back home. And so Joseph puts a plan together, and it's found in verses 14, Genesis 42, starting with verse 14. Joseph says to them, it's just as I've told you. I knew it. That's what he's saying. I knew it. You guys are spies. And this is how you're going to be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If you're not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph goes to them, and I don't know if this was part of the plan or if Joseph just had a change of heart or what, but he goes to them and he says, look, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, you say you're honest men, if you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go back and take the grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and you may not die. And so this is what they proceeded to do. Now, the guy who's kept in custody is Simeon, which was probably appropriate because Simeon was probably the guy that was the harshest with Joseph. He was kind of the bully. He was kind of the one that really caused problems. So Joseph may have just said, yeah, you stay. I don't know if they voted on it or what, but I suspect that Joseph may have said, Simeon, yeah, Simeon, you back in the dungeon. Don't know if that was the case or not. And we don't really, it says he was in custody, and they may have been kept in the castle somewhere. Maybe it wasn't in prison. We don't really know. It just says custody. Now, something happens that I want us to key in on this morning. In Genesis 42, verses 21 and 23. They said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. And Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. Then the passage says that Joseph turned away from him and he weeps. His heart's broken. He understands what's going on.